Thank you for appearing to show up on the podcast. It's really an honor to have you on.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
Yes, absolutely. So today we're going to discuss DMT, dimethyltryptamine. For those who aren't aware, an entheogen means to generate the divine within, and it's a subcategory of psychedelics. So DMT is produced endogenously or within the human body, and it has gathered a lot of attention in recent decades. Would you agree that you were the one that sparked a bunch of that with your research in the 90s at the University of New Mexico?
Well, first of all, I could address the issue of entheogen.
Sure.
Which I think is, kind of it's misleading in a way because it restricts the effects of the psychedelic. Psychedelic means mind manifesting or mind disclosing. So if one is so inclined to use psychedelic drugs for spiritual purposes, then they could have a spiritual effect. If you believe in divinity, then they could be what you would call entheogenic. But it really depends on the person and why they're taking the drug in the first place. For example, Charles Manson gave LSD to his followers in the 1960s and convinced them to be mass murderers, serial killers. So it's hardly appropriate to call to call LSD in that case an entheogen. It's more of what you would call a mind manifesting or mind disclosing drug, which is why I prefer psychedelic. Other terms for these drugs could be psychotomimetic. In other words, they mimic psychosis. And depending on who you give the drug to and why, and in what kind of situation, what the expectations are, you can make people psychotic. A few years ago, I was at an event with Alex Gray, and people were talking about entheogenic drugs, including Alex. And so after our presentations, we were walking around the conference center, and there were kids on drugs, dancing, screaming, going crazy. And I, turned to Alex and I said, entheogenic? and he said, well, maybe psychedelic is better.
That's funny.
So, yeah, I think you have to be careful with, terminology. For example, what happens if you take a psychedelic and you don't have an entheogenic experience? You'll be disappointed, and otherwise it could be very valuable experience, even though it isn't properly speaking entheogenic. Okay, I think I've beaten that horse. Well, our studies with DMT at the University of New Mexico were the first new human research studies with these drugs in the U.S. in a generation. So I think our work and the subsequent publication of DMT, the spirit molecule, and especially after the book was made into an independent documentary by the same name, it's really increased the visibility of DMT. But I wasn't the first person to look at DMT, to study it, to talk about it. It was discovered to be psychoactive in the 1950s in Hungary, and then was studied in the US and Europe for a number of years. And it especially became a topic of interest for psychiatry because it is endogenous. It occurs in the human body. And Terence McKenna, even though wasn't a scientist, was still an extremely articulate spokesperson for the DMT effect, the psychedelic effect. That's more or less how I first heard about DMT.
Interesting.
Yeah, so our study ran from 1995 to from 1990 to 1995, and what was interesting is that it required a couple of years of work with the FDA and the DEA to work out a means of giving a Schedule 1 drug to human beings, because it had been almost 20 years. So we established a mechanism for those two major agencies to interact with each other over clinical research with DMT and other psychedelics. But even so, it took the rest of the country at least 10 years to catch up with the work that we did in Albuquerque. There was a small study in Arizona giving psilocybin to people with obsessive compulsive disorder a number of years after our study. And, there was some ibogaine research taking place in Miami, but it wasn't until the projects that came out of, Johns Hopkins in around, 2005, where the, psychedelic research activity in this country really picked up steam again. In the meantime, there were experiments, going on in Germany, Spain, Great Britain. So I'm more speaking about what was going on in the U.S.
All right, so it was pretty collaborative, but yeah, your research and that documentary subsequently is actually what got me interested in the field when I was around 15 or so. And since being in the field of psychedelic research, I've seen a lot of misconceptions surrounding DMT and the actual truth behind it. For instance, when referring to its role in the human body, many believe it's primarily produced by the pineal gland, which Descartes coined the seat of the soul in the 17th century, which is like right in the epithalamus. And they also believe that it causes near-death experiences. But are these misconceptions based in some truth?
Well, the primary source in the mammalian body was always thought to be the lungs. DMT was discovered in high concentration in the rabbit lung and then other rodents, and then in other tissues like urine, blood, and spinal fluid. So I speculated in my DMT book and even before about the pineal gland perhaps producing DMT, which I speculated based on a lot of objective biological data. But it actually took another 13 years after the publication of the DMT book before it was confirmed that there is measurable amounts of DMT in the living rodent pineal gland. That was a paper that came out from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in 2013. So the pineal gland does produce it possesses DMT. So it may be that the pineal gland kicks in at other times other than kind of everyday consciousness, which could be more mediated through lung DMT. It's important to keep in mind that people without pineal glands live reasonably normal lives. They dream, they are pretty normal. The main abnormality that I've known about with respect to people without pineal glands is that it takes them longer to adjust to time zone shifts. intercontinental travel, those kinds of things, which is probably a result of the loss of melatonin, which is required for synchronization of our body rhythms, with the day-night cycle. Regarding DMT and the near-death experience, I also speculated about it playing a role in the near-death state, because of overlaps in the phenomenology, the descriptions of the two states. You're out of body, it's colorful, it's inhabited, you interact with the beings there. So to the extent that non-drug states, including the NDE, resemble those brought on by giving DMT, it makes sense that there's some underlying common biology. So I marshal a lot of evidence regarding a potential role of DMT in the near-death state in the DMT book. But it's one of those ideas that is it's taken a lot of time to experimentally test. So the same group in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which discovered DMT in the living rodent pineal, is also looking at what takes place in the dying rodent brain. So they're looking for increases of DMT in the dying rodent brain, but their results haven't been published yet.
That is interesting. I remember watching a documentary by David Nichols, which was about misconceptions of the pineal gland, and he seems to have the opinion that DMT couldn't have much of a role in near-death experiences. While it could have a partial role, he attributes it more to kappa opioid receptors and glutamate and asphyxiation, those kinds of things. But a recent popular journal, Frontiers in Psychology, I believe, published an article called DMT Models the Near-Death Experience. And it shows how similar the two experiences are and that it warrants further investigation. A similar landscape, similar entities, and similar subjective feelings for the people who go to the actual realm. Would you say that if DMT and near-death experiences were caused by different parts of the brain but can lead to the same effect, would that be evidence that it could be objectively real? Because if they were caused by the same part of the brain, if DMT causes a near-death experience and they're so similar, that wouldn't be too surprising. The same part of the brain is causing it. But if something else causes a near-death experience and then DMT causes its own thing, and they have a similar subjective experience, would you say that's evidence that the realms that they can take you to through consciousness could be objective?
Well, Dave Nichols Dave is mostly critiquing the notion that the pineal gland production of DMT is either or isn't mediating any subjective experiences, especially regarding the NDE. But he's ignoring the production in the lungs, the levels in the blood, and production in the brain. So even though, one of his major critiques is the presumed, very, low levels of DMT which occur in the pineal. Number one, we do not know what those levels are. So he's just extrapolating, saying, well, melatonin concentrations in the pineal are this and that, and DMT levels, even if they were that high, still wouldn't be high enough to impact consciousness. But that also ignores local production of DMT, diffusion to close by sensory centers, emotional centers, cognitive centers. So I'm not sure exactly why Dave is so hot under the collar about disputing the DMT pineal NDE thing. The jury is still out in a very large way. We don't know about brain production of DMT. concentration, or DMT is actively transported into the brain across the blood-brain barrier, which indicates a role for it in normal physiology. So all of those things point to a positive effect, or a positive presence of DMT in consciousness, either everyday consciousness or during states of mind which are not induced by drugs but resemble those when you're given drugs. That Imperial College study comparing DMT and the NDE was a questionnaire study. They gave questionnaires to people that had NDEs, and they compared responses to, they compared the responses to that questionnaire in people that they gave that questionnaire to a separate group of people who had used DMT. So then they compared the results on the rating scale. So that isn't an ideal study because you can tap all kinds of things with rating scales depending on the way the questionnaire is phrased, structured, yes or no answers. Depending on the overall intensity of any effect, either drug or non-drug extreme state, you can capture a lot of contradictory and inconsistent information from study to study, from individual to individual. So if you really wanted to put the pedal to the metal, or the metal to the pedal, with regard to comparing the DMT and the NDE state, you would want to give DMT to people that had an NDE previously and ask them to compare. Is this like your car accident NDE or your heart attack NDE? And I've gotten a few emails from people who have done just that. They had an NDE, or they had smoked DMT a long time ago, and more recently had an NDE. And I would say the majority of those reports is consistent with similarity. But until that real
near-death experience.
Right. I think that's the case. You're going to need to you're going to need to do an within individual study. You subject the same individual to the same conditions. One state, or one experiences DMT, and in that same individual, they undergo an NDE spontaneoly. I mean, you're not going to do flatliner kind of work, at least, not in an academic setting. There are, some interesting, corollary data regarding the NDE and DMT. There's a Hungarian group which has been looking at the response to nerve cells which are dying as a result of lack of oxygen, and it's a test tube study. And if you add, DMT to the mix, those nerve cells survive much longer, and the damage, done by low levels of oxygen, isn't as severe. So that makes a tidy picture in a way, or a tidy package. If DMT is released during the stress of nearly dying, or as you're dying, and there are some rodent data, some human data too, which indicate that levels of DMT increase with stress, and there's no greater stress obviously than dying. So if DMT is neuroprotective in conditions of low oxygen, that makes quite a bit of sense. It's released to save the brain, But at the same time, it is producing the last experiences subjectively that the brain is undergoing. So you would have to ask, why isn't that, protective agent, just, sedating? For example, it just makes everything warm and, dark and fuzzy, as opposed to, psychedelic, which is what occurs with the DMT effect and the NDE. So that is an interesting epistemological question in a lot of ways, because if you're dying and you have a DMT-like vision, what does that mean about where you are, where your mind is, and I think we're just limited in what we can do with respect to determining the reality of the states, either the NDE state or the DMT state. Nobody's come back from the dead. NDEs are called near death, because they are near death. They're not the death experience. Once you're dead, you're dead. Once your heart stops, it can be revived. Once your brain flatlines, it can be revived. But once you're dead, you're dead. You'd start decomposing, and that's about that. But the reality question with respect to DMT is very interesting. Because one of the most uniform descriptions of the state by my volunteers was that it felt more real than real. So that would indicate one of two things, or there, maybe even, two, sides of the same coin. You can look at it purely from the point of view of the brain. In other words, DMT is stimulating the reality center of the brain, the part of the brain that makes you understand, or that allows you to recognize, that everyday reality is real. And DMT may possibly stimulate that part of the brain to a greater extent than occurs naturally in everyday reality. But on the other hand, what defines our sense of everyday reality being real? Is it low levels of DMT that are keeping that brain center activated at a tolerable level? In which case, this reality is a low dose DMT experience in a certain way, and once you surpass a certain threshold, then things become even more real, and they become even more strange. So you can really kind of spin yourself into a loop as regarding regarding the basis of what and how you know it. But still, I think those experiments can be done. You can blockade endogenous DMT production or effects. The group in Ann Arbor is working on a knockout rodent which doesn't produce any DMT. So they're still working on developing that model. They're going to suppress the gene responsible for the enzyme which catalyzes tryptamine to dimethyltryptamine. And once they've got that animal model worked out, I think it'll be very interesting. Does that animal look depressed? Does it look stoned? Does it look completely alert to what's going on around it? What are its interactions? Does it interact more or less with what's going on around it? So I think we've just begun to scratch the surface about what DMT is doing in the human body, in the plant kingdom, in the animal kingdom.
In terms of this reality being a low-dose DMT experience, I would say that the similarities between the structure of serotonin and DMT might posit some evidence for that. And I remember you talking about in your book, do we make decisions based off of a subjective experience that is more real than real, even if it is subjective? And so I thought that was a really interesting posit. So do you think that these DMT subjective inner realms can be tested with the scientific method and potentially shown to be objective? I thought of one study where you send someone to the hyperspace and tell the discarnate entities or autonomous entity or machine elf or however you want to phrase it, tell it like a number, then have someone else go and ask what the number was and then make sure it's statistically significant. I mean, that would be one way, but I'm sure there's many. Do you think that it can be put to that kind of a empirical study?
Well, I think so, and I hope so, and I'm not sure exactly what that study would be. What you're describing is, something, similar to what Marco Rodriguez postulated in a journal called the Journal of Scientific Exploration a few years ago. I wonder what that ringing is. Marco recommended, giving the beings a prime number, factorization question. And, then, like it would, be an impossible thing for, somebody to know or to guess. And if the being gives you the right answer, bingo. But, there's a, number of, problems with that study. First of all, you need to, be able to communicate, that question. And, number two, you have to assume that the being either knows the answer or will tell you, the answer. They just may laugh, or they may, stab you in the eye.
Right.
If there's anything, they can do. Yeah. So, one of, my, harebrained ideas is, to develop, something like a dark matter camera where you can, photograph, more or less, the inhabitants or, the contents of dark matter, or even parallel universes, which is a, different, topic. So if you could, conjure up or compare, the images obtained by this dark matter camera and show it to a DMT volunteer, they could, verify or invalidate the degree of resemblance. Kind of like the question about dreams. Everybody agrees that we dream. There are common dreams. There's a dream language that you can share with people on a day-to-day, every like in an awake basis, everyday consciousness. But to map those dreams objectively, for other people to see, and to study the dream content, the dream state, the dream experience. They're beginning to do that. I think I'm no expert on brain imaging and MR functioning and all that, but I think they're beginning to generate images of brain activity during subjective experience. So if they can turn that to the dream state, then they may be able later on to turn it to the DMT state.
That's very interesting. I just saw something about being able to hook up a device that can give deaf people or mute people the ability to speak because it shows which regions of the brain are they're trying to activate with certain words. So that's another way that we could potentially map this out. So do you think that particle physics potentially disproves the possibility that non-local consciousness can exist? Because theories like orchestrated objective reduction, which is by Roger Penrose, shows evidence that, biologically and anatomically we could have consciousness received by the brain instead of being solely generated by it. But there's also things like the Standard Model and non-zero electron dipole moment that apparently show that there's no interactions in our physical universe with other dimensions. But I don't think that that's a consensus, and I don't think that the hard problem of consciousness is claimed to be solved by scientists. So I think metaphysics can potentially provide the answer to that, and entheogens or psychedelics like DMT could be one of the best ways to investigate that. What do you think in regards to that kind of content?
Well, I don't know much about particle physics or quantum physics. When I was writing the DMT book, I briefly corresponded with David Deutsch, who's written about the fabric of reality and dark matter parallel universes. I asked him if the brain's receiving characteristics could be chemically modified to the extent that it's able to peer into these parallel levels of reality. He's a smart guy, and I didn't understand much of what his answers contained. But we did veer off into whether the brain could be a quantum computer. Could you conceive of the brain doing quantum mechanical operations? And it seemed like it would hinge on superconductivity, which only occurs at the time anyway, or even before that conversation with Dr. Deutsch was only believed to take place at very low temperatures near absolute zero. But when we had that interchange in 1999, they were already being able to establish the existence of superconductivity at temperatures that were close to room temperature. And I'm not sure where things have gone in the last 20 years, but I would imagine that it's occurring closer and closer to biological temperatures. A few months ago there was a book published which is called Dmt Dialogues. I think it was published this year or late last year. And it specifically, works on or speaks of the nature of the beings, the nature of the DMT world, and there is one chapter in there by a theoretical physicist, and I have a chapter in there as well, which I discuss a number of different psychological, and religious and metaphysical models.
Interesting. I'll have to check out that book. I actually think it was recommended to me by my friend Chet, who researches Hebrew and Greek, I believe, so he can read the ancient texts. And he was a big fan of your work. It was the one after DMT, the Spirit Molecule. It was...
It's on your bookshelf, actually, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy.
Yep, there it is.
Right.
Yep,
Yeah.
I'm actually about halfway through that one, and he's really interested in the Greek and all that stuff, and the language with the Hebrew and all that. So maybe one day you'll end up talking to him. So I have one last question for you, and one side note. While I was in Brazil researching daime, which is a form of ayahuasca, but it's fermented, so they consider it a wine, they told me that Jesus wouldn't turn water into alcoholic wine, right, which would suppress your consciousness. But he turned it into a shamanic brew that elevated your consciousness, which is a wine. So I thought that was interesting local lore that Jesus turned water into daime instead. I thought maybe you'd appreciate that. But there's a common belief that DMT is produced in all life since it's derived from tryptophan. But is it actually in all life, like all plants and all animals? Is that a postulation or is there evidence for that?
It occurs in every mammal that's been studied. It occurs in hundreds, if not thousands, of plants. I think it occurs in sponges, fish, maybe
wow.
some fish. Yeah, so it isn't ubiquitous, but to strain an analogy, it's near ubiquitous. It is getting to the point that you would report as a species in which you can't find DMT as much as ones in which you can find DMT.
That's interesting. So it makes it the best candidate for being something that could transmit your consciousness into another plane or into, anything that's not localized within the human body. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about DMT. So thank you, Dr. Strassman, for agreeing to come on. I believe we've summarized pretty nicely the DMT and the misconceptions, and that it's not a panacea. Would you like to add anything to kind of finish up?
Yeah. Well, the story about, Jesus, turning wine into ayahuasca is interesting. It, comports, with the other major Brazilian ayahuasca religion, the UDV. Their mythology is that King that King Solomon, traveled to Brazil and introduced the use of the two plants, the ayahuasca plant and the chacruna plant, in order to produce, the psychoactive brew. So that's an interesting, corollary or an interesting overlap. There was something. Oh, it isn't a panacea. No. And when, people ask me about taking DMT, I say, don't.
Interesting.
Yeah, and obviously, people don't, follow my advice, especially if it's free. But I don't, number one, I don't want anybody, to break the law and get caught. But, number two, you really need to do your homework and be, pretty well, fortified, before embarking on a big, DMT experience. Without good supervision, good preparation, it oftentimes boils down to luck, whether your experience is, really great or really bad.
Right. Outside of metaphysics, there are a lot of benefits to psychedelics like DMT when it comes to healthcare, but usually that's in a supervised environment, not in one where you're kind of, doing things on your own without really knowing the full scenario of what's going on. And if you were to use DMT, I would, hope that you're using it within a legal setting, like with the Dmt Church. I believe they have branches in the U.S., but there's not so many, but they're growing. So it's not a panacea, but many people do believe it is, but nothing really is. So I think that's kind of what the word shows, is nothing is a cure-all for everything, and that DMT is no exception to that. So I think that that's a good summary of all of the misconceptions about DMT, the reality of it, and where we can go from here. And so it could potentially verify objective dimensions. It could show that consciousness is non-local, but at the very least, at the material level, it has a lot of mental health benefits. And so each area kind of deserves additional scientific inquiry so we can see the truth about the nature of reality and its relation to these psychedelics.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The whole issue of, panacea, which is a cure-all. And if you read the recent, psychedelic research literature, psychedelics appear to be a cure-all. They help OCD, depression, alcoholism, PTSD, cigarette abuse, opiate abuse, domestic violence, prisoner recidivism. They make you more open. They produce spiritual experiences. They make you appreciate nature more. So that smells like a panacea. But if you look a little more deeply, below, what is a panacea? I think a panacea is an agent that enhances the placebo effect, the placebo response, depending on, what the underlying material, biological and psychological, is working on, which is how you can describe the results of the Manson family and their use of psychedelics, turning them into serial killers who believed more firmly than anything else in their lives that there was this helter-skelter scenario that was about to take place, and they, as part of the executioners of the helter-skelter scenario, needed to kill people. So you can't really, call that a placebo. I mean, a panacea, but you can call it a placebo in, a compound, which increased, the placebo response. They were of the mind of X, Y, and Z that they took LSD with Charles Manson, and they became convinced of X, Y, and Z, and then went about, doing behaviors that followed up those beliefs, which were now much stronger and were as strong as any other experience that occurs when you take a psychedelic in a particular environment. So I think what we're going to be ultimately discovering, with the psychedelics, is that that their fundamental effect, their proximal effect, is they enhance the placebo response, which is a different discussion, and but the placebo response is real. It's got it works it works through the immune system, through the endocrine system. There's real objective biological kinds of healing which occurs with the placebo effect. You can block the placebo effect on pain by giving narcotic antagonists. So by calling it the placebo effect, that doesn't mean it's ineffective or it's snake oil. It means it's the placebo effect. It isn't an antidepressant effect primarily. It isn't primarily an anti-alcoholism effect. It isn't primarily it makes you more peaceful, but it works on the underlying strata, as it were, of the individual taking the drug, which is the reason that the education beforehand, the way the drug experience is managed, and the way the effects are integrated afterwards is key. You just don't give a drug and expect certain things to happen. They could, but if you really want to optimize the likelihood of those outcomes, you need to really steer things in a certain way and then apply the placebo enhancing effects of the drug. In our DMT study, we gave no coaching other than it's fast, you may feel you've died, don't worry, and we'll be here. And it's short. And with those instructions, people had their own trips. The one, urban shaman in the group, had a, classic, shamanic, death rebirth experience. The nurse in our study that wanted an NDE, who had been studying NDEs most of her adult life, experienced an NDE. The one religious studies major in our group who had always wanted a mystical experience underwent a mystical experience. A very nihilistic filmmaker in the group became even more nihilistic, more paranoid, got himself a weapon, all those things.
Oh, wow.
So if you just, give the drug, the drug itself has no inherent, either benefit or harm. It's just working on what is presented, as it were. So I think we really need to be, careful to not prematurely conclude that, psychedelics are entheogens or, psychotherapeutic agents or, whatnot. We have to dig deeper into, what is the underlying, mechanism of, their effect. So I think you could look at the spirituality enhancing effects, just in the same way.
Interesting. So is this where you see the future of psychedelic research going when it comes to the effect on the placebo response?
Well, I think to look at the mechanisms of how psychedelics work, I think that'll be key. Is looking at these drugs as the best tool so far to study the placebo effect.
Interesting. So we have a lot of real world examples to the benefits of psychedelics, and we have a lot of the examples of how they could be metaphysically showing examples of consciousness being non-localized. And then we have stuff without psychedelics too, like with Roger Penrose. He's doing a lot of good work in the research industry. So my last question, I guess, is for anyone who's watching this that wants to research psychedelics and wants to get into the field of real, like the nitty-gritty research part of it, what would you say to somebody that, doesn't really know where to start?
Oh, the standard answer that I give to everyone who says, how did you do what you do and I want to do what you did, is school, school, and more school. That's my standard answer. Get the best university education you can. Then you'll, decide if you want to, go to medical school and become a psychiatrist like I did, or, go to graduate school in psychology, neuroscience, whatever. If you want to work with humans, I think, psychiatry is the best way to go. You can do psychology, too, but you don't quite, have the same, grounding in, the biology and the body like you do if you're trained as a physician. If you're into, social, questions raised by the psychedelic, drug experience, social psychology is an option. I've steered a number of people into pharmacology research, neuroscience research. The questionnaire, the issue of, questionnaire research is key. How is the best, way to, tap into the, subjective effects in the most prudent manner, the most useful, if you're looking at, therapy, one set of questionnaires might be more helpful than others if you're looking at phenomenology, and so on.
And you need a medical degree to do research on human patients, right? Otherwise, you need an MD on your staff.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's one of the benefits of getting that. But maybe you could get an MD and a PhD if you're really smart. But that's too much work for someone like me. I just one or the other. That definitely makes things easier. So thanks for appearing on the show again, Rick. I think that we covered a lot of misconceptions about DMT and other psychedelics and the reality behind them. So I really appreciate you coming on. And then hopefully we can have another conversation like this in the future. Maybe one day we'll even research together.
Maybe. Well, do you plan on going to medical school?
Yes, I am finishing my psychology with pre-med with a focus in history this next year. And then I want to go to Ohio State's medical school, which is super, super good for public universities. I think it's number 3 in public universities for medical school, maybe number 2. So it's really good education. But if not, I'll just go somewhere else. But yeah, I do want to go to medical school and become a psychiatrist and then research psychedelics that way. But also research stuff like microtubules, which show that they could collapse the quantum wave function. And they also have a lot of research in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. So they have practical application and metaphysical applications, just like psychedelics. So both of those things I'm really interested in.
Yeah. Well, I'm in college. I looked at microtubule. What would I say? I looked at the branching pattern of axons in chicken embryo cells, and we speculated that my findings were due to microtubule effects. But that was a long time ago. Our lab had one of the few electron microscopes in the country. So that was at a very early stage of microtubular research.
That's interesting. Yeah, Roger Penrose's research with that is really great. So I kind of want to go into those fields, but yeah, maybe in 5 years, well, probably a little bit longer than that because there's residency. Maybe in like a decade we'll be working together, but we'll see what happens.
Well, once you've got your psychiatry training behind you, I recommend a fellowship. That's what I did. I did a clinical psychopharmacology fellowship after I completed my training in general psychiatry.
And then after the fellowship, you would be able to conduct your own research?
Well, you can conduct your own research at any point after you've got an MD, but if you really want to, know how to do research and establish the, critical relationships in a research, community, a fellowship is really helpful.
I remember you telling me about that because we were talking about medical MD/PhDs to be a research physician. You could just have a research fellowship instead, and that would save you a lot of time when it comes to getting a whole nother degree just to learn how to do research when you can just do it in a fellowship.
Yeah, and sometimes fellowships are 1 year, sometimes 2 years. Mine was one, but then I was on another grant for another 2 years, a post fellowship training grant when I first moved to UNM. So I was still pretty closely supervised in becoming a researcher.
So, and a fellowship is after residency?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So hopefully let's see. So that would be 9 years. Hopefully we end up working together. That would be wonderful. And if not, then, you could always serve as a supervisor or something, or, what's the word for it when you're not actually on the team, but you give input? I'm not really sure what that is.
Oh, consultant, mentor,
yes.
Wise guy. Yeah, any number of terms.
Right.
Okay, good.
Perfect. So thank you again for coming on, and let's keep in contact for some future work together. That sounds wonderful. We'll find out even more stuff about psychedelics.
Yeah, we don't really know much about them, right? It's the last frontier, I think.